Good afternoon, everyone. How are we all this afternoon? Good. Well, thank you all for being here for this dedication of the Cemetery Ridge Project, something we're all very proud of, both in the National Park Service and the Gettysburg Foundation. My name is Christopher Gwynn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation at Gettysburg National Military Park, and I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about what this place means, at least to me. And to do that, I want to go back to the 16th day of October, 1888. The surviving veterans of the 136th New York Volunteers paraded south through the streets of Gettysburg to this hillside along the Taneytown Road to a spot very near where we're standing right now. And by 1888, 25 years had passed since the Battle of Gettysburg. And these veterans came with their families, their children, their grandchildren to dedicate a monument to where on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, they had fought and their friends had died. The monument, an ornately sculpted stone depicting a war-torn tree trunk adorned with the accoutrements of an infantryman, had been placed along the shoulder of the road, overlooking an empty field, stretching from Cemetery Hill down to Seminary Ridge. And it's essentially the same field we see today. And we can only imagine the emotions of the men as they arrived that October day, armed with walking canes instead of rifles. And for the first time, for many of them since the battle, they looked across this landscape and the flood of memories and emotions that must have swept over them. For those 3 days in July 1863, the men of the 136th New York, they occupied this spot, dueling with Confederate skirmishers in the fields to the west, battling sharpshooters lodged in the buildings at the southern end of town. At Gettysburg, the men of the 136th New York were involved in nothing more than skirmishing. They never made any gallant charges, never advanced with their colors unfurled, never tenaciously clung to some knoll or spur against overwhelming odds. And yet, astoundingly, the regiment on this hillside suffered over 100 casualties, including 17 men killed, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting here at this spot. For the 136th New York, their battle at Gettysburg resembled more the fighting of World War II than it did of the Napoleonic combat that characterized much of the rest of the battle. It was intimate, it was brutal, it was outside convention, street fighting, ambushes, a battle for fence rows and backyards, street corners, and barns, with nothing to ennoble it or glorify it other than the knowledge of the cause for which it was being fought and waged. And now, in 1888, with their loved ones in tow, the aged veterans looked out over a landscape that in most respects bore a strong resemblance to what they had seen in 1863 and what we now see today. The odd house and building, but mostly open farms, fields, and orchards. Surely the town had grown, new buildings had been built, new roads laid, and like their own, monuments had sprung up across the battlefield. Otherwise, Gettysburg retained much of that same sense of place. The road behind you and the wall behind you, where they sought shelter, the open fields in front of you spreading west of the Emmitsburg Road, where they battled Confederate skirmishers, the swale, the ravine behind Cemetery Ridge, all were still there. A former soldier named Clinton Minor spoke at the dedication of their monument, and he said, "We think and speak of other fields where this band of patriots won other laurels, but not as we think and speak of Gettysburg. And today, after a lapse of a quarter of a century, my comrades, we gather here again. A shorter line, 'tis true, than when we last held the Taneytown Road, but patriots still." Minor called this spot and the fields that surrounded it holy ground. It would be here where the men of the 136th New York would be enshrined and where future generations would come to remember them and what they fought for and what they died for. And the Union veterans who returned here in 1888 were explicit in telling us why they fought and what they died for, at least as they understood it then. They fought for Union, and they fought to end slavery. Captain J.W. Hand of the 136th New York spoke for the veterans that gathered here and reminded them of what was at stake on this hillside in 1863. The defeat of our army, capture or annihilation, the seizure of the Capitol, the recognition of the Confederacy, the dismemberment of the Union, a worthless currency, the payment of indemnity to the victors, the perpetuation of human slavery. These are some of the consequences likely to follow if the rebels broke our lines. But they did not break through. Wave after wave of treason, billow after billow of rebellion rolled on, only to be dashed, broken, and scattered against that solid wall of patriotism along the Taneytown Road. And so that monument in this place was to speak for them and was to share that message. But by the conclusion of the next century, our own time, much had changed here. Open fields where once the men of the 136th New York had fought have been paved over. The view sheds and topography that would have been familiar to the veterans had been altered. Their monument, perched along the edge of an expanded roadway, received only scant visitation. Their flank markers stood on an island surrounded by asphalt, their bravery and their battlefield paved over, and with it the memory of what they did and why they did it. All this was done not by a developer mindless of place, but by the Park Service and by others who were stewards of the battlefield. And all of us here remember what used to be on this spot and across the valley in Ziegler's Grove, the old visitor center, the bus parking lot, the cyclorama buildings, a battlefield altered for a parking lot rather than a parking lot designed for a battlefield. And we can congratulate ourselves, rightly so, for now being the generation and the agents of taking this landscape and from it removing the last unnecessary vestiges of commercialism and development and giving it back to the men who fought and who died here. And in so doing, giving it back to ourselves and to our posterity. From the planning, researching, fundraising, the design and concept, the appeals and volunteer hours, detours and delays, controversies, a few court cases, this quarter mile of landscape might safely be considered the high water mark of the Second Battle of Gettysburg. And like the first, we can take pride in the results and in the victory. And let us, from this victory, rededicate ourselves to the challenge that await us, for like the men of the 136th New York, there are more battles to be battled and more fights to be fought. Little Round Top, new trails in the battlefield, new education initiatives, the Spangler Farm, all of this lay in front of us. I was speaking the other day with a friend of mine, a colleague, another ranger here, and we were discussing how you know if you've done a good job. How do you know with a task as enormous and as challenging as preserving and protecting and interpreting a place like Gettysburg, how do you know you're doing the right thing or you're on the right track? And we came to the conclusion that it would be best to imagine that with us, for everything that we do, is one of the men who fought here, one of the veterans who helped transform this battlefield into a memorial park. Because when men like the veterans of the 136th New York dedicated their monument on this hill and in this field, they expected it would be held in trust and cared for, along with their memory. And so we ask ourselves, would I be embarrassed to show a veteran of the 136th New York a parking lot where they fought? And I would. Would I be ashamed to have one of them on a tour or hike that I led? Would I be able to look one of them in the eye and explain what I did and why I did it? And I'd like to be able to think I can. When we manage the visitor center, the museum, the Spangler Farm, the Battlefield Park, we do it for this generation and the next, but we owe a debt and an obligation to the previous. Lieutenant L.A. Smith, of the 136th New York, wrote of this spot where we're standing now after the battle. He said, quote, "What a magnificent panorama was here presented. As far as the eye could reach until the earth touched the heavens in their convergence was one expanse of ever-varying field and wood, hill and dale, interspersed here and there with farmhouses." And I'd like to think if we could take L.A. Smith back and put him here and look at how much this landscape has changed and transformed in the past 2 decades, he would be proud of the work that we've all done. On behalf of the National Park Service, many thanks to you all for your time and energy and effort in helping make this transformation possible and for working with the Gettysburg Foundation. Speaking for the National Park Service, it is deeply appreciated and deeply meaningful. And now I would like to introduce the Acting Superintendent of Gettysburg National Military Park and Eisenhower National Historic Site, Tom Forsyth.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think we can leave it alone. Yeah. You know where you rate when they say the guy who's going to talk first gets 10 or 15 minutes, you get to talk second and you got 2 minutes, and then somebody else will seal the deal and he's got all the time he wants. So I knew following Chris that he was going to tell such an eloquent story and paint such an amazing picture of this place that y'all are looking down upon. I thought that I couldn't tell the story. I know I can't tell the story better than he can. So I thought what I would try to do is just add to that picture a little bit. This thing that we're looking at now started over 20 years ago. It is said that sometimes the first 90% of a project takes 90% of the time. The remaining 10% takes another 90%. This has been 20 years of work. So many people have been involved, from generations of superintendents, the resource management staff who did the studying and the research on all of this, the interpreters who told the stories about the places here that keep this place meaningful to everybody. But I thought we'd sort of just take a second and look at the time. Back in 1999 was when we decided we needed to do something, and we created what we call a general management plan that sort of outlays how we're going to manage this park. 2006, you all will know that the Gettysburg Foundation was created. 2008, the new visitor center was opened. And the year after that, because we were able to move the visitor center, we were able to take down the old visitor center in 2009. 2013, we were able to remove the cyclorama building. 2014, we removed a parking lot right over here and returned the grade. 2016, we condensed this parking lot, reduced it in size, and returned the grade and the terrain. I can remember riding through here with a couple of other managers pre-project, and we were looking at this and we remembered it being called a ravine. And we were looking at it on that day and it didn't look like a ravine. We didn't understand where the ravine was. And then the bulldozers got here, the cartographers, they laid the maps out, started doing the stuff, and now you can see the ravine. And I think of the stories that people told in those days about the fighting in the ravine. And you couldn't imagine it in that time because it didn't look like that. But now we're able to see it like they saw it. It's important that we're able to see it like they saw it because on these fields behind us, 977 people were either killed, wounded, or missing in action. Sacrifices were made, blood was spilled. This ground is truly sacred ground. And as Chris said, it's awesome, the responsibility, the honor, and the privilege that we have of caretakers of this place. I can't say enough thanks to the folks for the past 20 years in the National Park Service. I get to stand here one moment in time for my 2 minutes in front of the camera for a moment in fame, but the hard work, sweat, and tears of all those people for those past 20 years, they're the ones who deserve the applause. From the law enforcement staff who kept everybody safe while this construction project was happening over a decade, the resource management staff who researched it and figured out what it was supposed to be, just the list goes on and on. Everybody was involved. In addition to that, we have to thank the Friends Group who have done such amazing work for us, helping us in this place for the past 10 years. The accomplishments are clearly visible. And we call this almost complete, but the work in this place is nowhere near complete. We need the passions and the support of everybody for generations to come. Chris alluded to the project at Little Round Top. We've got work to do out on first day. The list goes on and on and on. There is so much yet to be done. With the passion that you all have and that our employees have had for the past 20 years, we will continue to keep moving forward to return this to what it was, to honor those who were here. It's with that I say thank you to the Friends Group. I hand it over to the president and friend, Dr. Matt Mullen, but before I give him the microphone, I want to give him a certificate of appreciation for the Gettysburg Foundation in recognition of the valuable contribution of the rehabilitation of Cemetery Ridge. It took all of us to get this done, and we thank you guys.
Well, I'm happy to accept that certificate on behalf of the many people who did this. As he mentioned, I parachuted in here, and so I'm not responsible for all the work that's been done. Other people are, and I simply have the opportunity to talk to you today. Those of us associated with the Gettysburg Foundation pause today, if only for a few unhurried minutes, to announce that with a final gift to our dear friends and colleagues here in the National Park Service, we bring an end to our role in one of the nation's most compelling and successful park preservation projects. This area was bitterly fought over by thousands of men, and for 154 years it has been relentlessly visited by millions of Americans trying to understand just what happened here. Their understanding is now substantially improved, initially by the removal and relocation of a visitor center, and then, among other things, by careful restoration of topography and landscape, reconstruction of walls and fence lines, reduction of a parking lot, relocation of monuments to the places intended by Civil War veterans, and a replanting of Ziegler's Grove trees. We deliberately picked this afternoon to announce, for tonight is the start of the annual fall muster of the Friends of the Gettysburg Foundation. It is the Friends who have played an instrumental role in making this preservation project possible through their labor, their gifts, and their love of this special place, and none more so than Barbara Finfrock. Scheduling this event today is a small way of saying thanks to the Friends. We're deliberately doing this in an understated way, consistent with the Friends' organizational ethos of quiet accomplishment. I searched for a quote that captures the spirit of the work of the Friends here on Cemetery Ridge, and I found it in the words of that wise old Pennsylvanian, Ben Franklin. Do not squander time, for that is the stuff that life is made of. Our final installment to Gettysburg National Military Park on this project brings the gift tally from the Foundation's gracious donors to more than $2.6 million over the life of the project. We remain steadfastly thankful to the hundreds of people who opened up their hearts and wallets for others, for future generations to experience a more authentic and understandable battlefield. We congratulate our friends in the Park Service who work here for the fine work they have done, and we wish them well in this and all future projects as they complete them. They've successfully recreated a key historical venue to better tell the profoundly human story that happened here. A complex story of courage and resolve, of determination and resignation, of violence and compassion. The Gettysburg Foundation is so pleased to have been a partner in rehabilitating Cemetery Ridge. In the future, as we look to particularly Little Round Top, we'll continue to move in concert with the Park Service to protect vital public spaces for future generations and to educate our fellow Americans about the significance of it all. But today, we get to savor the work done by so many and the vision of those involved in this generation, for they have indeed thought far ahead to serving many subsequent generations. Thank you for coming out today.